I want to give you a brief overview about the various and different ways that you can come to the United States temporarily. So that can include everything from coming to study or pursue a degree, to experience US life as an exchange visitor of some sort, or to work in the US economy or for a US company. Hi, I'm SohYoon Atac. I'm an attorney and one of the founders of SimVisa. We release videos about US immigration, the law, and other related topics. If this is of interest to you, please subscribe. Also, if you find this helpful, please like the video and comment below, as we definitely look at those for future content. So today we want to talk about a question that I've been asked a number of times, which is, how do I come to the US? Or how do I bring me and my family to the US? So that's a very broad question, because there are many different ways and many different immigration vehicles with which you and your family could come to the United States. So I won't be able to give you an entire education and primer on immigration law, because there are volumes written on this of the actual statutes, the guidance, and so much more. But I can at least do my best to give you an idea of the general framework that you may consider to see what of this applies to you or to you and your family. First of all, I want to say that I admire your interest and resolve, because personally, I love the United States and I feel like everyone should visit. But, to this very broad question, I guess my first step would be, especially if you've not been here before, then I certainly recommend exploring first the ways to visit here temporarily. Now, even when I say temporarily, there's a big range there, because that goes from, so here we call it non-immigrant visas. And that ranges from being a tourist. You could come for 2 weeks and take a tour of the national parks, or one of the many national parks, which are awesome. Or you could, or come as a student and stay for 4 years to do a bachelor's degree. So even this notion of coming temporarily is a big range. But in either case, I do recommend you come here on a temporary status, and so that you can see what it's like, either in a shorter term or in a slightly longer term, before you kind of make the decision to go for the immigrant status. So just to recap, one broad way of thinking of US immigration is there are non-immigrant and immigrant categories of visas. So non-immigrant is temporary, even though that temporary can mean kind of very short or kind of long, but it's still temporary, so that when you're done with that purpose of your visit, you are leaving the country, and that's the key. And that's the key intention that the US immigration and the officers at different levels, whether it's the consular visa interview or the CBP, the customs officer at the airport, that's what their a primary consideration to see if you qualify for that visa or that admission into the United States. And then the immigrant side, that literally means a green card. So that's the card is actually not green, but that's the term that everyone uses. It's the green card. And so that means you're here to become you want to become a permanent resident, where your primary living and place of dwelling is the United States. And that, if you fulfill a certain number of years of being a permanent resident and, without having other issues, then you can pursue US citizenship through naturalization, etc. So kind of keep those two big things in mind, the non-immigrant and the immigrant. So moving on, let's first talk about the temporary, the non-immigrant side of things. And really, there's a whole alphabet soup of visas available. There's actually quite a bit, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But let me talk about some of the more common or more oft used visa categories. So first of all, as I mentioned already, a most popular one, of course, is the B1/B2 temporary visitor for business, which is the B1/B2, which is for pleasure. And that's what we call a tourist visa, even though it's actually got a lot of different purposes. Oh, and by the way, we have a bunch of videos kind of talking about preparing for and kind of going through, and even the questions asked at the tourist visa interview, as well as videos about the different kind of less known purposes for that B1/B2 visa. So it could be from visiting for a medical purpose to, there's actually quite a bit under there too. And I think we'll continue to probably make those videos. But anyway, so that one is what allows you to come to the United States. And if you get a tourist visa and then you present yourself at the border to the customs officer, then assuming that there are no issues, you should be admitted into the United States for, and the typical time period is 6 months. Now, that doesn't mean you have to stay 6 months. It's probably, in fact, not recommended that you do, depending on the situation. But that's the typical tourist entry without issue. And so once you have your visa from the consulate and you enter, then you can, be a tourist and you can visit. If you have family or friends, if you know anyone in the US, obviously you could visit them. You could just be a pure tourist to see the sights or to experience the restaurants or the breweries or whatever you want to do in the United States. And that's a good way to see. And the United States is a humongous country. It's like, the size of a continent, obviously. So nearly. So there's a lot to do. And I think that's a great way, especially if you have a multiple entry tourist visa, to be able to be a tourist and really explore different parts of the United States. Now, by the way, if you have family members for the B2 tourist visa, there's not like a principal tourist and then you've got your family members that get derivative status. That's not the case for a tourist visa. So each member, including children, need to qualify for and get their own tourist visas. So moving on, aside from that, kind of the next level would be you can explore options, especially if you're at a point in your life where you're considering education or further studies. You can check out the F1, M1, or J1 type of visas. So those are like student visas or exchange visitor visas. So probably the F1 is the most common, and that's for an academic student. And so for that, you first need to be in touch with U.S. schools and universities, and you would need to work that through so that you can get this document called an I-20. And with that, there's a whole consular process. And again, here, we have some videos about the F1 and the various requirements financially, what you need to do, and how you can prove that you are a qualified student. So please feel free to check those out if this is of interest to you. But aside from, qualifying as an F1 student, and then you would be issued a visa from the consulate if your interview is successful and you meet all the requirements. Here, unlike the tourist visa, if you are the principal student, then your family members can be issued F2 visas, which means they're derivative or dependent beneficiaries. So that means they're not the ones, who's applied to the university, and gotten the I-20, but they're your spouse or minor children. So children under the age of 21 who are unmarried. So they would be considered children. So that's one way for you or you and your family to be able to come to the United States and live temporarily, but really be able to participate, in life here and see what it's like. And if you have minor children, then they can go to, public US schools, and that is completely authorized. So let me take a moment to talk about the J1, although now I'm wondering if this video is getting too long. But the J1, which is broadly, you can think of it as like exchange visitor, a category of a visa, but there are so many programs under there. It's got everything from the au pair program, which is where people can come and be here temporarily, going to school and working as a nanny for a US family. For everything from that to summer travel work programs where college students can, take the summer and come and work, for example, like at a seasonal US resort and kind of experience, American life, everything from that to, you could be an academic, a person working, in a college or being a professor. The J1 really has a very broad range and has many programs under there. So that might be something that might be appropriate for you, whether as a trainee or an intern and things like that. So I just want you to be aware that that's another temporary way to come to the United States and experience U.S. life in a work capacity or or otherwise. Now I want to move on to kind of the work or employment-based visas. So there we're talking, you might have heard of, the letters, part of the alphabet soup, like H-1Bs or H-2As or H-2Bs or L-1As and L-1Bs. So again, there are a lot of different categories, but these generally involve an employer who wants to hire you for a position. And there are very different procedures for these alphabet, visas that I've mentioned, but they first and foremost require a U.S. employer who's made you a job offer and they're willing to petition for you to be able to get one of these visas. So just to give you a short some information about this, the H-1B is for specialty workers, so people who are offered a job that requires at least a bachelor's degree in a specialty field, and that category has a numerical limitation. And what I mean by that is the U.S. government only gives out a certain number every year, and lately, like more than 4 times that number apply. So the way they deal with this issue is that every year there's a lottery system. It's usually in March, and you put your name into the lottery. And if you are selected, and it's not based on anything, it's random. If you're selected, then you can go ahead and apply for your employer can apply on your behalf for that H-1B, the petition, and then hopefully if it's approved, then you can get a visa and come. But that makes it a little bit challenging for the employer as well as for the candidate. There's also the H-2A and B, which is for agricultural or non-agricultural workers. These could be for jobs that do not require a bachelor's degree. And there's a kind of a whole system for that. And then there's also the L1A or L1B, so these L1 visas that are for intra-company transferees. So if you, for example, happen to be working at a company abroad that has a sufficiently related entity, in the United States, and they want to send you over, like, you work for a company in Brazil and then they have a US office and they want to, bring you here to work for a while, then this is something that would be appropriate. And this goes for executives, managers, and employees with specialized knowledge. So that's certainly an option to look at and for you and your company to explore. And then there's also the E2. Now that goes into probably the next category that I'm going to talk about, but the E2 is an investment-based visa. But what a lot of people I've noticed who've even researched this are confused by is they think, well, I'm not the investor investing the money, so I can't do an E2. But actually, we do a bunch of E2s where the visa holder is an employee of the E2 investor. So there are requirements like you have to be the same nationality as the investor, and the investor can be, an entity. In which case we get down to the nationality of the human owners of that, legal entity, a corporation or a, whatever, limited liability company. But either way, so there are requirements like that, or if the investor is an individual, then you would need to have the same nationality as that investor. But again, you can be an employee of an investor, so an E2 can apply even if you're not the investor directly. So I'm probably getting into too much detail, so let me move on. So next category that I'm going to talk about is the investment category. And here, really the primary vehicle would be E2 as well as E1 visas. And it's treaty investor or treaty trader, respectively, E2 and E1. And I'll talk more about the E2 because we tend to do more of those compared to E1s. So there's reasons for that, which I won't get into in this video. Sometimes E1 is a more appropriate vehicle, of course, but it depends on the situation. But here it requires that your country and the United States, the country that you're a citizen of, and the United States have an appropriate treaty. It's usually like some type of a treaty of friendship and commerce, where they kind of typically mutually grant this benefit to the citizens of the other country. So, and it's a little surprising what countries have this E2 or not. So, for example, Iran, you would think with all the issues between U.S. and Iranian relations that wouldn't have this treaty. But because the treaty's quite old, that treaty exists. And yet there are countries that are very friendly with the United States, but they just don't have the treaty. So it's a little surprising. And this is something that always needs to be checked, whether you're qualified or not. But if the countries have the right treaty, then if you invest a certain amount of money, and this is not the $1 million level investment that we're going to talk about on the immigrant visa side of things, the green card side of things. But we can say maybe anywhere around $100,000, or really does depend in our experience kind of in the country where you're coming from. But it can actually be lower, and certainly it can be higher, then there might be a way for you or you and your family to be able to come to the United States and invest in the country and have your own business and to be able to be here temporarily. And this one, even though it's temporary, it can be renewed without, so long as you're complying with the terms and conditions of the visa, there's not a limit, as some of the other categories that I've talked about do have a, like a year limit, or how many years you can be here in that status. The E2 does not have that. So there are people here who are on E2s that have been here for like a decade or more. So that's a possibility, again, to temporarily be here and to experience American life and, see what you think of it. I'll just say about the rest of the alphabet soup, there are other categories that are probably less commonly used. But for example, we've done visas for, performers to come and perform. We've done, like cultural exchange visitors, and then there's visas like religious workers and H3 trainees. And so there's this whole alphabet soup. But I hope that this kind of brief intro at least gives you some idea of the broad framework of ways to temporarily visit the United States. So kind of to recap, that includes, we talked about the tourist or a temporary visitor for business or pleasure. We talked about exchange or student, like education related ways, which is F1, M1, J1 type of categories. We talked about work related non-immigrant visas. So the H-1B, the H2s, the Ls, and maybe even as a E2 employee. And by the way, I didn't go into this, but within these non-immigrant visa categories I talked about, there are a few dual intent things, but that's probably getting into too much detail, although that can be useful for transitioning to a green card, but I'll save that for another video perhaps. And then we talked about investment ways potentially. And then of course that there's a whole bunch sprinkling more that I haven't covered, from, you could be a media person, like a journalist here on an I visa, or, you could be a diplomat, you could be, all those kind of other things. But hopefully this gives you some idea. So whichever way or the different ways that you explore and that is the most appropriate for you, I wish you a great temporary visit to the United States. And I hope you get to experience, some of the big range of the people, the culture, and the things to do that are in the United States. Bye-bye.